If you've been listening to my podcast, this part's going to sound familiar, and it should, because everyone knows about the Black Dahlia. Everyone knows that name, or let's be more respectful and call her Elizabeth Short. Very few people know the man the police quietly followed afterwards. A respected doctor, a Hollywood insider, a man whose house was bugged by the LAPD while a mutilated woman lay in a vacant lot. They listened to his conversations, they watched who came and went, and they wrote his name down, and then they let him walk. Years later, another woman vanished. You may have heard of her. Her name was Jean Spangler. There was no body, no crime scene, just a note. This is not a story about a serial killer. It's a story about what happens when investigators get close, but then they have to stop. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in Hollywood is not a murder. It's knowing who might have done it and deciding you cannot ask them why. This is Deadly Truths with Becca. Before we go any further, this needs to be said clearly. George Hodel was never charged, tried, or convicted in connection with the murder of Elizabeth Short or any other homicide discussed in this episode. What you are hearing is an historical analysis based on documented police files, contemporaneous reporting, and modern behavioral interpretation. References to surveillance, wiretaps, and suspicion reflect law enforcement interests at that time, not legal findings or guilt. This episode does not assert certainty, assign criminal liability, or claim resolution of unsolved cases. It examines why certain individuals drew investigative attention, why cases stalled, and how institutional decisions shaped what the public was and was not allowed to know. In other words, this is not an accusation, it's an examination of record, context, and unanswered questions. Listeners are encouraged to approach this material critically, recognize the limits of surviving evidence, and understand the difference between suspicion, probability, and, of course, proof. That distinction matters, and respecting it is part of telling these stories responsibly. So tonight, we're talking about George Hodel, what the record actually does say, and what the record does not. Most people think unsolved crimes disappear because there are not enough clues, and that's not usually true. A lot of cases don't die from lack of evidence, they die because evidence points towards people no one wants to accuse. Hollywood figured this out early, and if you haven't noticed, I've been covering that in my other episodes prior to this. If a suspect was poor, unstable, or already on the margins, the system could move fast. But if a suspect was educated, wealthy, respected, and socially insulated, the case didn't explode. It stalled, it softened, and eventually it just stopped. Tonight we're talking about a man who fit that second category perfectly. He's not a drifter, he's not a gangster, he's not a nobody. He's a doctor, a socialite, a man whose dinner parties were attended by artists, musicians, and Hollywood insiders, a man the police believed was capable of sexual violence, a man whose house was secretly bugged by detectives, a man whose name was written down and then quietly set aside. And that man, if you haven't heard his name, I've said it twice before, I'm going to say it again, it's George Hodel. Now, let me be clear about something. This episode is not here to tell you that George Hodel definitely murdered anyone. What we are doing here is harder and more unpleasant. We're looking at what law enforcement actually knew, what they suspected, and what they recorded, and where the investigation stopped, not because answers ran out, but because consequences begun. And ahead of time, I'm going to apologize again. I've got a horrible head cold, so that is why my voice is very gravelly. Sounds like I'm like a chain smoker or something, so apologies in advance. But I do love doing these episodes and all the research, so I can't help but get on here and record anyways. So let's dig into it. Once we try to understand how George Hodel moved through the system, you start to see why certain women were never fully defended, including one you most likely know by name. That Elizabeth Short was 22 years old when her body was found in January of 1947. And I covered this tragic and terrifying story in a prior episode if you are interested in more details here. So, in this episode, we don't need all the gritty details repeated. They've been turned into spectacle for decades. What matters here is this: her murder was meticulous, it was deliberate, and disturbing enough that detectives believed it required skill, control, and privacy. To keep it quick and to the point, the reason detectives believed it required all three was the body was cleanly bisected at the waist with a technique consistent with surgical or some type of knowledge of anatomy. Not a random attack, clearly. And there was no hesitation damage. And that means that there's no sloppy cuts, there's no panic marks. So this was somebody who was familiar with doing this and comfy with doing it, right? The body had been thoroughly washed, and that indicates that they had some time to do that. They had privacy, and they obviously had a method to wash the body. There was no blood at the dump site, meaning the killing and everything that happened to Elizabeth happened somewhere else, somewhere private. The position of her body, the posing, clearly deliberate, suggesting planning and psychological control, not rage, control. So, in short, no pun intended, this was not someone who lost control. This was someone who had it from start to finish. And that's why detectives didn't look for a drifter. They looked for someone who knew anatomy, had access to a private space, and had the confidence to take their time. George Hodel, he had all three, right? That does not make him guilty. But it's why police did not dismiss him either. And it is why they did something extraordinary. They listened to him. They placed microphones inside of his home and they waited for him to talk. And when he did, they heard things that made them uneasy, but not enough to take the case where it would have to go next. Still, let's get into this part of it, right? The nitty gritty, because George Hodel didn't end up under surveillance by accident. Someone inside the LAPD made a decision. Now, there's no record of who that is. It's just not verifiable. However, we are not talking about a hunch or a rumor after Elizabeth was found murdered. The case was assigned to experienced homicide detectives. They weren't rookies and they were not paper pushers. And by all accounts, historians and profilers in modern day say that these detectives actually did a really good job for that time frame in the 1940s. So early on, those detectives realized something, which is what I went over prior. The crime did not look impulsive, it didn't look messy, and it didn't look like something that happened by chance. And honestly, I mean, even us or some of us that are listening, not speaking for everybody, I'm not a cop. I'm not into doing forensics, never have. And just by knowing about the case, I would say, wow, that's not an impulsive act, right? So once the autopsy results were revealed, the conversation inside the department shifted. They weren't asking who might have snapped. They were asking who could do this and not lose control. That question narrowed the field fast. And that's when one name kept resurfacing: George Hodel. Not because someone saw him with Elizabeth Short, not because he confessed, but because he sat at a very specific intersection that scared investigators. He had the medical training. Because of that medical training, he obviously knew anatomy, he clearly had privacy, and he had a reputation, quietly whispered about, not publicly printed, for crossing lines. Then something else happened that pushed him from concerning to we need to watch this man. Detectives were already dealing with separate allegations involving Hodel, including accusations of sexual abuse inside his own household. And that mattered because to detectives, that wasn't a moral failing, it was behavioral evidence. It told them this man was capable of violating bodies, violating trust, and doing it behind closed doors calmly, repeatedly, and without panic. At that point, investigators didn't need certainty, they needed proximity. So, someone inside the LAPD, right? They authorized a move that was very rare for back then. They tapped his house. Let me be clear about how unusual that was. This was the late 1940s. Wiretaps were not routine, they were not casual. They definitely weren't used on respected doctors with money and connections unless detectives believed the risk was justified. You don't bug a man's home unless you think he might talk, he might slip, or he already knows more than he should. For months, they listened. They recorded conversations, they logged visitors, they waited for something solid enough to force their hand, and what they heard disturbed them, but it didn't give them what they needed. There was not a confession, not a provable admission, not a piece of evidence that could take to court. Clearly, because we're talking about it right now, they did choose to stop. And that decision tells you everything you need to know about why George Hodel matters. Not because he was arrested, not because he was convicted, but because experienced detectives believed he was dangerous enough to listen to and then chose not to confront him. That's not failure by ignorance, that's restraint by calculation. Okay, so at this point, you might be wondering the same thing I was wondering. What kind of doctor was this guy and where did he actually work? George Hodel wasn't some celebrity surgeon or forensic specialist that was attached to the police. He was a licensed medical doctor working in a private practice in Los Angeles. And that matters because private physicians in 1940s had a lot of autonomy. He had hands-on medical training, surgical experience common for doctors of his era, but he wasn't operating under hospital oversight or constant supervision. He treated patients quietly, moved in professional circles, and answered to very few people. That combination, medical skill, privacy, and social isolation, is exactly why detectives did not dismiss him. He didn't stand out as a criminal, he stood out as someone who could do precise work without panic and without witnesses. Now, there's a lot of information floating around out there, and some of it claims that George was secretly performing abortions for Hollywood women. That story gets repeated a lot, but here's what we actually do know. There is no documentation showing that he was an abortion provider. There were no arrests, there were no charges, no medical board actions, no police files tying him to illegal procedures. What is true is that in the 1940s, illegal abortions were common. They were dangerous and they were handled quietly. And private doctors often knew how to make problems disappear, whether by referral, silence, or simply not asking questions. That makes George adjacent to speculation, not proven activity. And that distinction does, of course, matter because there's a big difference between what people want to connect and what the record can actually support. So when you really look into George, you're going to start asking the same questions that I was asking. How did the cops even know this guy was worth watching? Because George Hodel didn't look like a suspect on paper. He was never arrested. He was never caught with evidence. He was not a sloppy person. So why him? This is where George stops being a theoretical suspect and starts being someone the police already knew they had a problem with. It came from inside his own home. George's teenage daughter, Tamar Hodel, accused him of incest. And this is not a rumor, it is not a whisper, it is a formal accusation. She told authorities her father had been sexually abusing her. She described repeated assaults, and she testified. And here's the part people gloss over. Doctors examined her, and medical findings supported abuse. This was not dismissed as a teenage drama. It was taken seriously enough to go to court. Now, this case didn't end in a conviction, but not because police decided it never happened. It collapsed on procedure, credibility battles, and the brutal reality of prosecuting powerful men in the 90s. But by that point, the damage was done because for detectives, this wasn't about winning a trial, it was about his behavior. Once a man is known to violate his own child behind closed doors, you don't need imagination to believe he's capable of extreme harm. You don't need a motive speech and you don't need a confession. You already have a pattern. And that pattern is exactly what moved Hodel from an interesting person to someone that they needed to watch. Once you understand that, the surveillance makes sense. They weren't hoping that he would brag. They were listening because they already believed this man would talk freely about things most people would never admit out loud. And that's the shift. George didn't enter the investigation he entered it as a known risk. Tamar accused her father of repeated sexual abuse. She did not describe a single incident. She described ongoing assaults. She stated the abuse happened inside the family home, and she was specific enough that the authorities obviously took all of it seriously. And this was not a vague claim. It was detailed and it was consistent and it was formal enough to proceed. Now, the abuse was described, as I had said, as repeated over time. It means clearly this was not a one-off ordeal. It was a pattern. And that distinction clearly stood out to police because pattern equals behavior, not impulse. As a mother myself, I had curiosity as to where her mother was during this time frame and what part her mother played in this, if any at all. And here is the sad truth, but also typical for the era. Tamar's mother was present in the household when this was going on. There is no evidence that she ever intervened effectively. Whether she knew the full extent, that is completely unclear. What is clear, though, was that Tamar was not protected. And in the 1940s, mothers had little legal power. They had few resources, and there was enormous pressure to preserve family reputation. And that context does matter because silence was not unusual back then. It was actually expected. After those accusations, Tamar was removed from the home, and she did not remain under her father's control. In that era, children were rarely removed unless authorities believed harm was real, so I think that that's critical. The case ended without a conviction because of the credibility attacks typical of incest prosecutions. And how rare was it to accuse a father in the 1940s? Extremely rare. This cannot be overstated. Incest was almost never reported back then. Victims were usually disbelieved. Families were pressured into silence. Accusers were often institutionalized or discredited. And for a teenage girl to accuse her own father, undergo the medical exams, testify, and then be removed from the home, that puts this case far outside of the norm. It tells you how serious authorities thought it was. There are stories about George's parties as well. And like most stories that survive this long, they've grown teeth. What's actually supported is simpler and also disturbing. He hosted frequent private gatherings that were sexually permissive for the era, drew in people with less power than him, and operated in spaces that he controlled. I don't know about you guys, but this probably sounds familiar to some things that still go on today, right? You've got a really rich guy, he's got a really nice place, he's got a lot of booze, and he invites a bunch of people over, and they get drunk and they do a bunch of things, and he thinks it's a great time, but sadly, the people that are getting involved in this don't have as much power or control that the person who's throwing the party has, right? Without naming names. So police didn't believe crimes were happening in plain sight, but they did believe those environments created opportunity. Combined with proven sexual abuse inside his own home, it told detectives this was a man comfortable exploiting vulnerability without witnesses and without consequences. And that's not spectacle, that's risk assessment. So what was caught on the wiretaps for George Hodel? The LAPD secretly recorded conversations inside his home from 1949 until 1950. The tapes do not contain a confession, but they do contain statements that alarm detectives enough to keep listening. So the most cited line is a variation of, and this is in quotes, "Suppose I did kill the Black Dahlia. They couldn't prove it now." There is important context to take into account. It was not a direct confession. It was speculative and conditional, and it could be bravado. It could be dark irony, right? Why detectives cared? Innocent people rarely speculate out loud about having committed a notorious murder, and the tone suggested familiarity with the investigation, not distance from it. This line didn't give police probable cause, but it confirmed they were listening to the right person. Across the recordings, detectives noted a comfort discussing harm in abstract terms, though, and a lack of shock or moral recoil when violent topics were brought up. There were remarks that implied awareness of how crimes go unsolved, but nothing actionable. There was a mindset that made investigators uneasy, of course, but again, nothing they could act on. The tapes also captured conversations reflecting control that he had over others, and there were sexualized power dynamics, and he had a dismissive attitude towards vulnerability and, of course, consent. And this matters because it aligned with what police already knew from the beginning of this case. The tapes didn't introduce new behavior, they just confirmed a pattern. There was never any mention of Elizabeth Short as a person on those tapes. He did not express any empathy, express outrage, express curiosity about the victim. Instead, the references, when they did occur, were abstract and detached. So now we just got to double down on what was not on the tapes. There was no step-by-step confession. There was no description of the crime scene. There was no admission of killing Elizabeth. There was no discussion of Jean Spangler, who I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. And there was no evidence of murder planning. Clearly, if any of that had existed, this case would look very different. But the key point, and this is what you want to understand, the tapes did not prove guilt. They proved risk. They told detectives this man was not horrified by violence. He was comfortable discussing it privately, and he understood evasion, and he did not self-censor when he thought no one was listening. And that's why the wiretaps did continue, and also why the case stalled, because to move forward, police would need physical evidence, a witness, or a confession, and the tapes gave them none of those. It only left concern. When you do any deep digging on this entire case, obviously there's a huge question about George's son, Steve Hodel. He wrote a book claiming that his father killed Elizabeth Short, and I think it's really important to discuss that. First, he stumbled onto evidence by accident. This was not a lifelong crusade for him. Steve Hodel had been clear about that. While reviewing family history and old records, he came across LAPD surveillance files, wiretap transcripts, and documentation showing his father was a serious police suspect. I'm sure everybody could understand how shocking something like this would be. That moment changed the frame from eccentric father to law enforcement believed this man was dangerous. At that point, ignoring it would have meant walking away from evidence most people never see. Also, Steve wasn't just a civilian hobbyist. I mean, he was a lifetime LAPD detective. He was familiar with cold cases, and he was comfortable reading police files, not just headlines. And that gives a lot of credibility here, right? This isn't tabloid garbage. The case had been prematurely abandoned, and important material had been buried, not disproven. If you look at this from Steve's perspective, this isn't betrayal, it's unfinished police work. Also, once Steve fully confronted the incest allegations against his father, the story shifted. That case established proven capacity for sexual violence, abuse conducted privately and repeatedly, and protection through status and intimidation. For Steve, this wasn't character gossip. It was behavioral evidence that made the Black Dahlia theory feel plausible, not sensational. And Steve's core argument is not just my father did it. It was that the LAPD believed George Hodel was capable of the crime. They got close and then chose not to pursue it because the case would collapse in court and damage the department. That belief, whether you agree or not, is what drove that book. He wasn't trying to shock people. He was trying to explain why the investigation stopped. When you're looking at this case and examining it, I think it's important to look at where Steve Hodel's case is the strongest. And most historians agree he did real work. He proved George Hodel was a legitimate LAPD suspect. He documented the wiretaps accurately. He resurfaced forgotten investigation threads, and he showed how institutional hesitation shaped the outcome. Without his book, George Hodel would still be dismissed as fringe. That all being said, we also have to discuss where his case weakens. And this is where we need to be clear. Personal proximity creates bias, right? He's accusing his own father. That's not neutral ground. It increases the risk of confirmation bias, pattern over interpretation, treating plausibility as proof. It doesn't invalidate his work, but it does limit it. The theory also expands too far. In later writings, Steve Hodel connects his father to multiple unrelated murders, long-running serial activity. Most historians agree this dilutes the strongest part of the argument. One solid suspect theory becomes a lot weaker when it tries to explain everything. There's also no new physical evidence that ever emerged. And this is the hard stop. Despite all the research, there's no DNA, there's no witnesses, no forensic link tying George Hodel to Elizabeth Short. So Steve's case is circumstantial. The honest conclusion is Steve Hodel wrote the book because he believed probably his father was a real suspect, right? Steve Hodel didn't write his book to shock people, I don't think. He wrote it because he found proof his father was a legitimate police suspect, and he believed the investigation stopped for reasons that had nothing to do with innocence. The Black Dahlia investigation didn't stop because police cleared George Hodel. It stopped because they believed they couldn't prove it without destroying themselves in court. The LAPD didn't treat his father like a fringe name. They surveilled him. They wiretapped his home. They documented concern. That only happens when detectives believe a suspect is dangerous, insulated, and legally untouchable. Where Steve may have overreached is turning suspicion into certainty. But where he's probably right is this: George Hodel was never ruled out. The system just decided it was safer to stop pushing. Some historians land in the same uncomfortable middle space. George Hodel was not some random prank theory, but he also wasn't a solved answer. Historians do acknowledge that the LAPD didn't wiretap him casually, didn't document concerns casually, and didn't keep him on internal radar without reason. His behavior, associations, and the level of police attention placed on him well outside coincidence. But historians also emphasize what wasn't recovered. There was no physical evidence, no confession admissible in court, no single piece that crossed the legal threshold from suspicion to certainty. In other words, history doesn't exonerate him. It just refuses to crown him. Modern profilers are blunter. Many argue that George fits a type, but not a verdict. He had medical knowledge, access, privacy, psychological indicators of control and sexualized violence, and a documented pattern of disturbing behavior, including towards his own daughter. To profilers, that matters. But they also note that the Black Dahlia murder was so extreme, so surgically staged, that confirmation bias is dangerous. Their consensus isn't he did it, it's this: if we're building a modern suspect pool from scratch, he would be in it, and you would not dismiss him lightly. That's not smoke and mirrors. That's unresolved risk. Jean Spangler enters this narrative not as a solved link, but as a warning flare. In 1949, she vanishes after leaving home to meet someone she trusted, telling friends she was going to see a man named Dr. Scott. Now, I did cover her in great detail as well in a prior episode. So, in this episode, I'm going to go over the basics with a little bit more detail on the note that she left. But if you want to hear more about her, and of course, Janine French, who also gets linked to the Black Dahlia Elizabeth case, you can find that in a prior episode that I did. So, Jean Spangler, what was found later was not a body or a clean crime scene. It was her purse in Griffin Park, staged and planted just enough to end the conversation before it got dangerous. LAPD treated her disappearance likely as a lifestyle problem, not a crime, and within weeks the urgency evaporated. No sustained pressure, no reckoning. Another woman gone, another file cooling quietly. Here's where the overlap becomes impossible to ignore. Dr. Scott was a common alias used by physicians performing discreet, often illegal medical services in Hollywood. Abortions, treatments no one wanted on paper. That immediately pulled investigators towards the same underground medical world where George Hodel already sat uncomfortably on their radar. Again, there's no proof that he was doing that, but there was a lot of speculation. There's also no proof he ever met Spangler, no document tying them directly. But the environment is the same. Powerful men, private access, vulnerable women, and a system that looked away the moment accountability got complicated. What police actually found in Jean Spangler's purse was this note, right? To Kirk, widely understood to be actor Kurt Douglas, with whom she had recently worked. The note read, "Kirk, can't wait any longer. Going to see Dr. Scott. It will work out best this way while Mother is away." That's not a suicide note. It's not a goodbye. It's not a written in panic. It reads like logistics, timing, privacy, expectation of return. The reference to her mother matters because Florence Spangler was out of town visiting family in Kentucky at the time. Jean lived with her mother and relied on her for childcare. Here is where investigators then and now draw a careful line. The phrase, "it'll work out best this way," has been used for decades to imply pregnancy or an abortion, but no medical confirmation exists that Jean Spangler was pregnant. None. What does exist is a woman arranging a private medical meeting in an era when women had almost no safe legal options and leaving a paper trail because she expected to come home. That's the pivot point. The note doesn't explain why she vanished, it explains why she felt safe enough to go. And that's why historians still treat it as one of the most quietly damning pieces of the case, not because it proves what happened, but because it proves Jean Spangler didn't think she was walking into danger. There's no direct evidence that that note found in Jean Spangler's purse was planted after her disappearance. Handwriting was never formally challenged, and the note was consistent with her known associations and schedule. On paper, it could be genuine, and that's why police leaned on it so heavily. But there's a big problem. The note functioned too perfectly, in my opinion, and I know that there's many who agree with that. It immediately redirected the investigation away from homicide and towards a private, personal explanation, a doctor visit. I mean, it even says Dr. Scott, a possible pregnancy, a voluntary choice. It narrowed the scope instead of widening it. And critically, it allowed the investigators to stop asking who she was meeting after the appointment, who last saw her alive, and who might have had access to her purse once she was gone. And in a cold case, opportunity plus convenience is never nothing. The placement's just wrong. Jean's purse wasn't found where someone dropped something in distress. It was discovered days later, deliberately positioned, not scattered, not damaged by weather or animals, in a way that you would expect if it had been there since the night that she had vanished. That alone tells you someone had possession of her belongings after she disappeared. Really accept that? Every item inside that purse, including that note, becomes suspect by association. Also, the content of that note, it's just way too useful. It does three things instantly. It reframes the disappearance as voluntary. It introduces a medical explanation that shuts down homicide thinking and narrows the suspect pool to vague, untraceable figures like Dr. Scott. Whether the note was written by Jean or not, it functioned exactly like a planted note would. It gave police and the press a clean psychological exit ramp. Third, the note froze the investigation instead of advancing it, right? No aggressive hunt for the doctor, no pressure on last known contacts, no sustained effort to reconstruct her movements after she left home. The moment the note entered the story, urgency collapsed. Spangler was divorced at the time from Dexter Benner, and yes, he was questioned early, mostly because that's what police did to ex-husbands in the 1940s, and that's what police continue to do. And in some cases, thank goodness for that, right? Police looked at him because they had to. Custody disputes, past domestic tension, and optics of divorce, but nothing stuck. No motive that fit the timeline, no access after she left home, no evidence tying him to that purse, to the park, or her last moments. By all credible accounts, he was cleared and moved out of the focus fairly quickly. That's why serious historians don't keep him in the frame. If Jean was meeting anyone that night, it was not her ex-husband. The mystery starts after she left home, not with the man she already left behind. So if we're going to converge on anything, it's going to be the context again and not a culprit. There was a underground Hollywood ecosystem in the late 1940s. Private doctors, fixers, discreet intermediaries where vulnerable women interacted with powerful men in places and spaces that left no paper trail. In that environment, disappearances didn't need violence to succeed. They needed silence, plausible deniability, and just enough evidence to redirect attention. And that's why Jean Spangler's case remains unsolved. George Hodel left LA in the mid-1950s. He relocated to the Philippines, where he took a position as a medical advisor and later worked in public health. There was never any extradition effort, no renewed push. The case didn't close because he was cleared. It stalled because the suspect was gone, protected by distance and jurisdiction. That's why his departure sits where it does in the story, not as proof of guilt, but as the moment the trail went cold. As far as official records go, he lived out the rest of his life as a respected physician abroad and later returned to the U.S., dying in 1999 without being arrested or tried for any major crimes. Our Hodel, George's teenage daughter, the LAPD did take those allegations seriously. She was removed from the home and put into protective custody. That case did collapse in 1950, not because the allegation was disproven, but because Tamar was pressured, isolated, and ultimately recanted on the stand. And that's a big one. So she later said she did so under intense coercion, and I do not find that hard to believe. After that, she was sent away to live with relatives and in institutions, effectively disappearing from the public record. Therefore, the abuse case was dismissed. Tamar never returned to a normal relationship with her father, lived much of her life out of public view, and died young in 1972. There was no reckoning. Her allegation was credible enough to trigger rare police action, and it collapse fits a familiar pattern of mid-century abuse cases involving powerful men. The system protected the adult, the child paid the price. That's the truth that survives the paperwork. Here's where all of this actually leaves us. Without myth-making, without any movie villains, and without pretending the gaps are answered. The deaths and disappearance of women like Jean Spangler and Elizabeth Short don't point to a single hidden mastermind waiting to be unmasked. They point to a system that consistently chose speed, reputation, and convenience over truth. When investigations closed early, when evidence was softened, when narratives were redirected towards personal trouble. That wasn't incompetence, it was a decision. The second thing to understand is that suspicion is not the same as certainty, but it isn't nothing either. George Hodel sets in the story not as a solved answer, but as an unresolved risk the system declined to confront. History isn't saying he did it. History is saying we stopped asking before we were forced to find out. And finding the most important takeaway: these stories aren't about monsters hiding in shadows, they're about power operating in plain sight. Women were vulnerable not because they were reckless, but because the structures around them made disappearances survivable for everyone else. When you strip away the mythology, what remains is not a puzzle begging to be solved. That is the truth without mystique. Not every case has a villain, but every case has a choice. And in these stories, the choice was silence. We don't close the story with certainty, and that's not a failure. It's the point. This isn't about proving one man guilty or rewriting history with a cleaner ending. It's about recognizing how easily systems learn to stop looking when the people who benefit from silence are the ones in control. The past isn't always mysterious, it's more like selective. And every time a death is labeled unfortunate, private, or inevitable too quickly, what's really being decided is whose life is worth examining and whose isn't. All right, so this has been a deep dive into old Hollywood, and we're not done with it, not even close. I plan on doing considerably more shows on some other fascinating lives and deaths. But after digging into the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth in one of my past seasons, if you have not listened to that, I recommend you do. I keep getting drawn back and fascinated with some more cases that involve prisoners and famous prisons. So next, I want to go somewhere colder, quieter, more isolated even than Leavenworth, because some of the most disturbing stories in American crime don't belong to killers on the streets. They belong to the men who were removed from society and locked where the country hoped no one would listen. I want to talk about Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, not the tourist version, the men, who they were, what they did, why those men were sent there instead of anywhere else. Because Alcatraz was not just a prison, it was where the system put people it did not want to explain. And once you start looking at who ended up there, the place gets a lot more unsettling than the legend ever did. That's next. If you're still here, you're the kind of listener this show is for. Follow Deadly Truths with Becca wherever you are listening. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Just listen. Just put it on play and zone out. Every listen counts. Share the episode with someone who doesn't buy easy answers, because these stories don't spread unless people pass them hand to hand. And if you want deeper dives, primary sources, and episodes that don't make the algorithm comfortable, you'll find everything linked in the show notes, because the past is not dead. It's just waiting for someone to pay attention. And I think it's you.